Right now, in the time it takes you to read this sentence, a car crash has happened somewhere on Earth, and the person inside is alive because of a strip of woven nylon anchored at 3 points to a steel frame, a geometry so elegantly simple that engineers today cannot improve on it. That invention exists in roughly 1 billion vehicles. It has saved, by conservative estimate, over 1 million human lives since 1959. You almost certainly cannot name the man who designed it. His name was Nils Bohlin, and the story of what happened to him is not a story of theft in the dramatic sense. No courtroom, no villain twirling a mustache, no patent stolen in the night. It is something quieter, and in some ways more troubling. It is the story of how a corporation's act of apparent generosity became the perfect mechanism for erasing the man at the center of it. How altruism, weaponized as brand strategy, can be more effective than outright theft. And how the most life-saving mechanical invention of the 20th century made its creator almost completely unknown. Nils Bohlin was born in 1920 in Härnösand, a small coastal town in northern Sweden, where the winters arrive early and stay long, and people tend not to speak unless they have something worth saying. He was not a showman. He was not interested in fame or in the performance of genius. He studied mechanical engineering and found his calling not in grand theories, but in the specific, unforgiving discipline of keeping human bodies safe inside machines moving at lethal speeds. His first job out of school was with Saab, the Swedish aircraft manufacturer, where he spent years designing ejection seat systems for military fighter jets. Think about what that work requires. You are engineering for the worst possible moment, the moment a pilot has already lost control, when the aircraft is failing, when survival depends entirely on a mechanical sequence working perfectly in a fraction of a second. Bohlin learned, at a granular level, how the human body fails. Where it breaks, what forces it can and cannot absorb. He understood that in a sudden deceleration, the body does not experience the event the way the mind does. The body simply continues moving at whatever speed it was traveling until something stops it. His whole career was about controlling that stop. In 1958, Volvo hired him away from Saab. The automotive industry was growing fast, roads were filling up, and cars were killing people in enormous numbers. The statistics from that era are staggering. In the United States alone, roughly 40,000 people were dying in car crashes every year by the early 1960s. Volvo's leadership believed safety could be a commercial differentiator, a reason for customers to choose their cars, and they needed someone who understood human anatomy under mechanical stress. Bohlin was that person. He arrived at Volvo's engineering facility in Gothenburg with a specific assignment: design a seatbelt that people would actually wear. That last part was the critical constraint, and it is the part that most histories gloss over. Seatbelts already existed. The lap belt, a single strap across the waist, had been in use since the early part of the century. It was, in theory, better than nothing. In practice, it was not much better than nothing. In a frontal collision, a lap belt holds the pelvis in place while the torso and head continue forward at speed. The result is a catastrophic folding of the body, severe abdominal injuries, spinal fractures. Racers called it the submarining effect. People who wore lap belts and survived serious crashes sometimes wished they hadn't, and so most people didn't wear them. There were also 2-point shoulder harnesses, military style, that crossed the chest diagonally. These prevented the upper body from pitching forward but created their own problem. In a crash, they concentrated enormous compressive force on the ribs and sternum. They were also cumbersome to put on, often requiring both hands and deliberate effort, which meant most civilian drivers never bothered. Bohlin's insight was not by itself a single thunderclap moment. It was the product of months of careful work, of sketching and testing, of understanding how the skeleton and musculature actually absorb force. What he arrived at was a solution so clean it almost looks obvious in retrospect, which is always the mark of genuine genius. A single continuous belt, anchored at 3 points, one at the shoulder, one at the hip on the door side, one at the hip near the center console. The diagonal portion crosses the chest and shoulder, distributing force across the thorax. The horizontal portion locks the pelvis. Together they work as a system, spreading deceleration forces across the body's strongest structural members, the collarbone, the chest, the pelvis, rather than concentrating them at a single point. Crucially, and this is the engineering detail that made everything else possible, the system buckled with one hand in a single motion. You reach across, you click, done in under a second. Bolin understood that a safety device which required effort would not be used, and a device not used saves no one. The simplicity was not incidental to the design. The simplicity was the design. Volvo introduced the three-point seatbelt in August of 1959 in the PV 544 and the Amazon, fitted as standard equipment, not as an optional extra, not as a premium upgrade. Standard. Bolin held the patent. Volvo owned the patent as his employer under the terms of his employment. That is important to hold in your mind as this story continues. The belt worked, not just marginally, it worked dramatically. Early internal studies at Volvo showed that the three-point belt reduced fatalities in frontal collisions by a factor that made every other contemporary safety intervention look trivial by comparison. The data kept getting better as more cars were fitted. By the mid-1960s, it was becoming undeniable to anyone studying automotive mortality statistics that this one device was altering outcomes at a scale that dwarfed nearly everything else the industry was doing. And then Volvo did something that has been celebrated ever since as one of the great acts of corporate generosity in industrial history. In 1962, they opened the patent, made it available to every automobile manufacturer in the world, free of charge, with no royalty requirements. Any car company could use Bolin's design without paying a cent. The standard framing of this decision, the framing Volvo has promoted, and that the press has largely accepted for 60 years, is that it was a humanitarian gesture, that Volvo chose people over profit, that they sacrificed potential billions in licensing revenue because they believed human lives mattered more than shareholder returns. That framing is not entirely wrong. The people who made that decision almost certainly did believe the belt should be as widely adopted as possible. There is no evidence to suggest the decision was cynical at its core. But framing is not the same as truth, and a decision can be genuinely good and simultaneously serve powerful strategic interests. What the open patent did for Volvo, what it has continued to do for Volvo for more than 6 decades, is something that no licensing arrangement could ever have achieved. It made Volvo synonymous with safety itself. Every time a journalist writes about the three-point seatbelt, the story is, Volvo invented it and gave it away. Every car safety retrospective, every anniversary piece, every corporate responsibility case study says the same thing. Volvo's generosity is the narrative. Volvo is the protagonist, the man who actually spent months in an engineering facility working out exactly how the human clavicle and pelvis could share a mechanical load. He is, at best, a footnote. Consider what Volvo received in exchange for foregoing licensing fees. First, total competitive safety positioning. No rival could claim this innovation because Volvo had already claimed it by giving it away. The act of giving it away became the proof of ownership. Second, decades of earned media and brand association that no advertising budget could purchase. Third, a foundational identity, safety, as the Volvo brand that differentiates them in the market to this day. The estimated value of the Volvo safety brand has been placed by various analysts in the billions of dollars. The licensing fees they waived were, from a business strategy perspective, a remarkably efficient investment in something far more durable: reputation. None of this money, none of this recognition, none of this brand equity flowed to Nils Bolin. He received his engineer's salary. He continued working at Volvo as he always had, doing the work he loved. By most accounts, he was a modest man who did not experience his situation as an injustice, at least not publicly. He was an engineer. He wanted the belt to be used. It was being used. There was something quietly admirable in that. But quiet admiration should not be confused with justice. The recognition that did come to him arrived late. In 1985, the German Patent Office listed the three-point seatbelt as one of the 8 most significant patents of the previous century. They estimated the invention had saved over 1 million lives by that point. Bolin received some professional acknowledgement from within the engineering community. Volvo gave him an internal award. He was inducted into the Automotive Hall of Fame in 1999, 2 years before he died. He died in 2002 at the age of 82 in Gothenburg. You would be hard-pressed to find a street named after him. There is no Bolin Prize, no Bolin Foundation. The invention that has prevented more deaths than almost any other mechanical device in history did not generate a fortune for its creator. The fortune it generated, the soft, enduring fortune of brand trust and corporate identity, went entirely to the institution that employed him and chose how to deploy his work. And here is where this story asks something of you, as someone who has almost certainly buckled that belt today without thinking about it. The three-point seatbelt is now estimated to save over 15,000 lives annually in the United States alone. Globally, across the billion-plus vehicles equipped with it, the number is staggering. The cumulative total since 1959 is estimated to exceed 1 million people, 1 million human lives, each with children and parents and decades of unlived mornings. One man's work in a Gothenburg engineering facility in the space of a year produced that outcome. By almost any utilitarian metric, it is the most consequential safety invention in modern history, and its inventor is a name that most people, if you stopped them on the street today, would fail to recognize. What does that tell us? Not about Volvo specifically, because Volvo's decision to open the patent was, on balance, a net positive for the world. More people are alive because of it. The moral accounting there is not simple. But what it tells us is something about the machinery of credit, about how institutions can absorb the legacy of individuals, how an act of genuine generosity can simultaneously serve as an act of erasure, how the story of a decision can become more powerful than the story of the invention itself. Bolin never filed a lawsuit. He never gave bitter interviews. He continued working. In some telling of this story, that restraint is framed as noble, the pure engineer, unbothered by ego, satisfied that his work did what it was meant to do. And perhaps it was. But there is another reading, that the structures around him, his employment contract, his era, his nationality, his temperament, left him no real avenue to claim what was his. The patent was Volvo's. The narrative was Volvo's. The salary was his compensation, legally and formally, and he accepted it because that was the deal he had made, and that was the world he inhabited. Innovation does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs inside institutions, inside employment contracts, inside power structures that determine who owns what gets made. Bolin is not an aberration. He is a pattern. The history of technological progress is dense with people like him, individuals whose specific, irreplaceable insights became the foundation of institutional fortunes, while the individuals themselves received what their contracts specified and no more. The system is not broken. That is what the system is designed to do. When you buckle your seatbelt, and you will, the next time you get in a car, the motion takes less than 1 second. Bolin designed it that way on purpose. He knew that if it took 2 seconds, half the people would decide not to bother and the bodies would pile up. He gave you that single motion click because he was thinking about the moment you would not be thinking about it. He was thinking about the crash you were not yet in. That level of care for strangers, for future strangers, people not yet born, people he would never meet, is what the best engineering actually is. It is a form of moral work, even when it is not recognized as such, even when the person who did it is not recognized at all. His name was Nils Bolin. He worked in Gothenburg. He understood how a body breaks, and he designed something to stop it from breaking. And then the world moved on and mostly forgot his name, while the institution above him kept the story and the legacy and the billions in brand value that story generated. The belt is still there, across your chest, exactly as he designed it. Nothing about it has needed to change. That is how good it was.